So the title of this talk, Human Trafficking Happens Here, Exploitation and Trafficking in Santa Cruz County. And that's pretty much what we're going to be talking about today. And so I know I see a few of you from our morning talk. And so this is going to get a little more in-depth into kind of the dynamics of human trafficking, some of what we've seen in Santa Cruz County, and then ending with kind of how y'all can support ending human trafficking, working with our organization and all that good stuff. So without further ado, my name is Sydney Woodward, and I am project manager and an on-call advocate with Monarch Services. We are a local nonprofit organization that supports survivors of sexual violence, including human trafficking. And we'll talk a little bit more about Monarch Services towards the end.
So I'm Deborah Pembrook. I chair the Coalition to End Human Trafficking in Santa Cruz and Monterey counties. And I also work as an outreach advocate at Monterey County Rape Crisis Center, which is a direct service organization in Monterey County that serves survivors of human trafficking, child abuse, and sexual assault.
So before we really get into it, I'd love to just kind of hear your perspectives on, what is human trafficking? If you were to just give a quick definition, what is human trafficking?
Let's say forced prostitution.
Forced prostitution, definitely. It can definitely be forced prostitution. So the definition for human trafficking is a crime involving exploitation of someone for the purposes of either forced labor or commercial sex, i.e. forced prostitution, through the means of force, fraud, and coercion. And human trafficking includes both labor and sex trafficking. There are many forms of human trafficking under those umbrellas, so there are many kind of guises of what human trafficking can look like under those two umbrellas. And it's important to note that for folks under the age of 18, there doesn't have to be the prevalence of, or the presence of force, fraud, and coercion for it to be human trafficking. So if someone under the age of 18 is being, forced into some kind of work situation, forced into some kind of sex situation, that falls under the definition of human trafficking. Even if they chose to do that, it's still a trafficking situation, even if the other elements aren't necessarily there.
There's a way we kind of define it, and I don't know if anyone was in the Kid Power presentation before then, but they had lots of make a trash can and throw insults in the trash can and all kinds of hand motions. So we have a hand motion that we do around the definition of human trafficking that I think might be helpful. We say human trafficking has a two-part definition. At its core, it's when someone is forced to work through force, fraud, or coercion, a phrase we'll be using throughout the presentation, force, fraud, coercion. This can be when someone's forced to work in agricultural fields, forced to work in a restaurant, forced to work in a traveling sales crew, forced to work in really any kind of way. It can also include when an adult is forced to work in commercial sex. And we have to throw that caveat in about when it's an adult who's forced to work in commercial sex because of that second part of the definition. So the second part is any youth, anyone under the age of 18 who is involved in commercial sex in any way, that is by definition human trafficking. And the difference is in that case, force, fraud, and coercion doesn't have to be proven for it to be human trafficking. Because when this law was established, it was known, and I think this is very smart, that a child wouldn't be involved in commercial sex if force, fraud, and coercion wasn't present. So it can be assumed.
What's the fraud for commercial sex for adults?
So someone who thinks they're going to be working in a restaurant, they're instead working in a brothel.
But if it's not fraud, then it's not human trafficking?
It's an or. Force, or fraud, or coercion. Yeah.
So it should be, so force, fraud, and coercion, but kind of any of those three, any combination of them. And we'll kind of talk a little bit about how those things interact within the trafficking situation, basically how those kind of interact, and so you can kind of see why survivors are in that situation, how that kind of can play out for adults and for children. And any other questions about this? So, sex trafficking, so sex trafficking versus labor trafficking. So like we said, with human trafficking, there are two kind of main umbrellas of trafficking. So for the definition of sex trafficking, it is modern day slavery in which commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which a person induced to perform such an act is under the age of 18 for the TVPA, so the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which actually was only implemented about 18 years ago in 2000. So this is surprisingly a fairly new law about how we kind of think about those who have been in these trafficking situations. And then with labor trafficking, we have the recruitment and harboring and transportation provision or obtaining a person for labor services through the use of, again, force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of subjugation, involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, slavery. And so some of those things, sometimes people ask, you know, what is debt bondage? But what that can kind of look like is, let's say someone gives them an advance on some kind of money that they need, and then they say, okay, pay me back. You have to work this X amount of time to pay me back. Then that person starts to work. Then they say, well, now actually you haven't worked enough, even if they've met the quota for what they needed to work. They say, you haven't worked enough. Now you owe me even more of your time. And it just continues like that, where the person really has no options to leave.
And it can get ridiculous. I mean, cases where someone's charged $200 for use of a shampoo bottle, where there's no connection to what the cost actually is, but it's just a mechanism of using debt to control someone and keep them working so they're profitable for the person who's exploiting them.
So it always has to be for money? I know someone who was forced to be in porno films when she was a kid.
Yeah.
And it does. So that's under a different definition then.
So that would still be human trafficking, because there's exploitation, and those for people who sold those, porno films were making money.
If they sold them, if they didn't sell them, then it would be under a different classification.
If they didn't sell them, it would still be human trafficking, because it's still exploitation of the child. So there doesn't have to be necessarily money changing hands for it to be human trafficking.
Even if they're an adult, there doesn't have to be money changing hands?
Correct. There can be situations where, let's say I am being trafficked and it's just a pure situation. Maybe and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the vulnerabilities and how this plays in, but maybe I have a substance abuse issue and the trafficker is now playing on that, and so there's no money changing hands, but I'm being supplied with my substance of choice. There are other situations where maybe it's not necessarily money changing hands, but another exchange of goods or an exchange of some kind of value that's attributed.
Well, in her case, it wasn't an exchange of anything.
Well, that pornographic material is what's being exchanged. Yeah. So that's the material thing that's being exchanged in that situation.
And you are touching into kind of gray area. So if someone is assaulting a child and sexually abusing them and filming it, and they are not distributing that, that's for their own personal use, that might not be considered it. But if they're sharing it, then they're often doing it in exchange for, I'll show you what I have and we're going to exchange it. So once there's an exchange, we're pretty solidly in human trafficking.
Otherwise, it's okay.
In that first case I was talking about, where if someone's using it for their own personal use, it may be that the investigation just wasn't able to really find that part where it was being exchanged, because that is extremely common. And so if someone's filming a lot, it's just, so it gets into kind of a gray zone. So we in some of these cases, it's like we have suspicion, there are warning signs, and we don't necessarily know. Where we often get the biggest picture is when we listen to survivors, because they're often really hearing the full picture from the trafficker of what's happening.
Any other questions? That was a great question. Thank you. So
For those of you who were in our earlier presentation, you heard me talk about both talk about the National Human Trafficking Hotline. It's a great number to know, 888-3737. Actually, I'll go ahead and pass these out. We have some information that comes from Monarch.
I can pass it out while you talk.
Great, thank you. From Monarch and from the Coalition about Warning Signs of Human Trafficking. Why I'm passing it out is on that is the National Human Trafficking Hotline. The National Human Trafficking Hotline is a great number to call if you're seeing something, you're not sure what it is, and you just want to talk over, is this something that needs to be, have some action taken? Obviously, if there's someone who's in clear distress or something that's happening that's timed, you want to call 911. Never want to divert someone away from calling 911. But the National Human Trafficking Hotline isn't law enforcement, so it gives, particularly for survivors who are calling the hotline, a chance to really weigh over what do they want to have happen. And it gives more options, because sometimes once law enforcement is involved, options can be kind of taken away. So all of that is to say, this National Human Trafficking Hotline, which has been in effect for over 10 years now, realized about 10 years in that they had the largest database of information on human trafficking of anywhere in the country. And they started looking at that data set to really understand how is this functioning? How is this interacting with the world? So it's an extremely important tool for law enforcement to really understand this as a business model and how are different forms of human trafficking interacting with the world. So they divided human trafficking from their data set into 25 different types. Everything from someone who's doing commercial sex in either like in hotel or street-based setting, dividing up those 3 different models, to agriculture, to construction, to landscaping, to traveling sales crews, which is actually a pretty prevalent forms of human trafficking. Have you ever had someone in a lot of distress knocking on your door trying to sell you vacuum cleaners, magazines? And a lot of people will kind of have this sense of, yeah, the person seemed like something wasn't okay with them, but I didn't quite know, and so it seemed like maybe it was just part of the sales pitch. What we now know from this investigation that Polaris was able to do, that's a particular kind of human trafficking, where often young people are moved to a new location, kept disoriented because they are removed from all of their different resources. There's kind of a particular pattern to it, but in the end, people are often just left on the side of the road in a strange community and not paid. And so that is a particular form of human trafficking. So in looking at these different 25 types, we as a community wanted to say, well, what of those are happening here in Santa Cruz? And so we talked with Monarch, we talked with all the members of our coalition to end human trafficking. And of those 25 types, we found either active cases or very serious warning signs of 20 of those 25 types. So the ones, it's kind of hard to see, but construction, landscaping, arts and entertainment, factories and manufacturing, and recreational facilities were the only ones where we didn't see warning signs as of today. And frankly, we don't think that that's because construction doesn't have trafficking in our community. It's that we haven't done enough outreach to really be able to hear about these warning signs. And maybe we should pause here. Any questions about this? Sometimes when there's a lot of information on one slide, but sometimes people have a question of, well, what does this in particular mean? And I'm going to take a minute for that if you, yeah.
For the healthcare one, what do you mean by human trafficking in healthcare? Or
so it tends to mean either someone who's a home healthcare worker, someone who's in a house or an apartment that's needing to do that kind of domestic work around the clock. So that kind of a healthcare setting. Also, we see the terms coming to mind is retirement homes, but I know there's like a more appropriate term. Care facilities. Yeah. So there's a lot of trafficking, particularly of Filipinos. Filipinxs in that sector, and so in fact there's some really amazing survivor leaders in Los Angeles who come out of that trafficking experience. Now, so it's not usually in the big hotel setting, which is kind of a trend with human trafficking. It's not in large institutions. It tends to be more in small businesses, medium-sized businesses, where there's less tracking, there's less people really looking to see what's happening in those centers. But that's not to say that it doesn't exist, and because there was a case in California of a number of foreign nationals who were brought in on a particular visa to work as nurses that did experience trafficking through that kind of visa violation. So it can take different forms, but in general, it tends to be in these isolated small businesses. Really good question.
You said these 20 forms you found evidence of?
We either saw very serious warning signs or there were active cases.
Okay.
I should also say there's some forms that we see that are pretty predominant, particularly in Monterey County, around forced marriage. There's a community from Oaxaca where there's that has the largest population in the United States is in Greenfield, a community in Monterey County. And there's been a lot of issues around forced marriage and exploitation. It's a very complicated case. It involves a paramilitary group in Mexico. That is a pretty unique form of human trafficking to Monterey County and to this community. Doesn't show up on the 25 types. So it's not to say that's the only form of trafficking happening in our community. Yeah, some here and there. Yeah.
Well, sorry, but why are some of those in red and the others not?
Yeah, good question. So the ones that are in red are the ones that we haven't seen active warning signs, either warning signs or cases in our community. All the ones in black we have.
I was just gonna add that, I read this so long ago, I forgot the kind of fish we're not supposed to eat, but there, in the fishing industry, there's trafficking of men and they get them out
Yeah.
in the middle of the ocean and it's something about them having their work off.
I can share about that. Yeah, so that's actually a local reporter, Martha Mendoza, who it happens to be stationed here in Santa Cruz, or living here in Santa Cruz, who broke this international story about trafficking in the fishing sector. A lot of her work initially started in Indonesia, trafficking of men predominantly from Burma, from Myanmar, and other Southeast Asian countries. I highly recommend this reporting. Literally life-changing, literally resulted in hundreds of men coming forward to escape all at once off boats. Really incredibly compelling. And this human rights journalistic work happened from someone here locally who's come and spoken at our coalition. What she's also reported about, though, is trafficking that's happening within the United States, some of which have included men fleeing boats in San Francisco, fleeing into the community in San Francisco. Had a chance to talk to some of those survivors, and it seems as though there may have been some fishing was happening in the Monterey Bay area. So, and I think that's a perfect example of why you wouldn't see that on a hotline data set, because those men don't have access to a cell phone. They're not going to be able to call. And it's as far as I know, pretty predominantly men. It's what I'm gendering that. But when Martha Mendoza came and spoke, one of the things she talked about was the fishing of squid that happens in Monterey. That's where the manufacturing starts in Watsonville, but a lot of it then happens in China. She was able to document Chinese factories that she doesn't know if directly if they came from Monterey Bay, but they were a squid that had North Koreans doing most of the work. And North Korean environment where there's massive slavery, people aren't freely able to choose the work they are able to do, and then that's funding nuclear proliferation. So in some ways we're looking here at a local issue of human trafficking. It connects to issues of human trafficking happening all over the globe, and including, it's intersectional with issues including nuclear proliferation. Nuclear proliferation in North Korea. So the human trafficking is funding this nuclear proliferation. So it's a very intersectional issue. At the same time, we're focused on the community here in our community. So yeah, then there's a question.
I was just going to say, anecdotally, there's a lot of talk about massage parlors and nail salons in this community. How would you describe that as an access of human trafficking? Is it as prevalent as we think it is?
Well, it's the second most common form on this list.
And we, Monarch directly has had, folks calling saying, this is the situation that I have. If I can get folks to come to you, would you support them? Oftentimes, because we're seeing that those folks maybe speak like Cantonese or Mandarin and things of that nature, and there aren't these services widespread for them. We tend to kind of focus on like our English speakers and our Spanish speakers within this community, because those tend to be kind of the big populations that we see. The ones that are kind of unseen are within those situations, definitely.
So those are prioritized by members? That's not something you mentioned. You said the second most prevalent.
Yeah, so I don't think I mentioned that. So if you can imagine like each column going down, so it's most common, so these come according to the data set. Yes.
Yeah, we have
There's a hand up over here. I just want to get that after.
Oh,
Here we go.
Which one is the most common for children?
Escort services and outdoor solicitation, about half of all of what they found were children. So commercial sexual exploitation of children. And so what?
These carnivals up there.
So sometimes the people who are working in carnivals, and if we go back into like old literature, people's associations with carnivals, there's kind of this kind of mystique about people working in that industry, and there being a lot of exploitation in that industry, and it's a very insular industry. Frankly, I did not know this until this report came out. what we know is that that really hasn't ended, that the traveling nature of carnivals can keep people working and exploited. And then once we knew about this, literally from this report, we were finding signs of it in our community. So that's one that's changed color in the time we've been using this slide.
Wait, so does that mean like the Santa Cruz County Fair, like the
We don't have an active case from the Santa Cruz County Fair, but people who work in traveling carnivals are really at risk. So there's the potential that, so just like we have, construction, landscaping, agriculture, not everyone who's working in those fields is someone who's trafficked, but they're very much at high risk. So a really good question.
Data question, top 25 international or something?
In the United States.
Okay, and then the ones that dark are the ones that are here, but not
Right.
organized by here.
Not organized by here. So yeah, so we're trying to convey a lot in this slide, but yeah.
So, a little bit about myths about trafficking. So, this is really, well, I'll go back a little bit. It's really important to kind of address some of the myths of human trafficking because if we're not aware of those myths, then oftentimes it can be really easy to kind of not see survivors. As I said, the ones that we kind of see versus the ones that we don't see. So some of the common myths for human trafficking are that trafficking must involve a form of travel, transportation, or movement across national and state lines. And this really isn't the case. A lot of the time, because it's human trafficking, people think about like drug trafficking, and that's typically moving from one place to another. But human trafficking can happen, unfortunately, just out of one building, out of a person's home. And so sometimes survivors will kind of see this notion of human trafficking where people are being funneled around the country, and they're like, oh, well, I was just in one building for 10 years, so this can't be trafficking, this is something different. And so it's really important to kind of address that myth, especially when we're working with law enforcement and social support agencies. And then we have that physical force or physical restraint must be present for the identification of trafficking. Also, again, not true. It can be really hard for people to kind of wrap their heads around like, well, why would someone stay in a situation so horrible if they aren't being physically restrained? And so we're going to talk about that a little bit later because it's really important to kind of understand that dynamic to really understand human trafficking. But no, trafficking does not have to require physical force of any kind or even physical restraint. Then we have that trafficking only occurs in illegal or underground industries. We just saw a slide addressing the fact that that is completely not true. Sometimes survivors are like, well, I was working in a restaurant that's really reputable, so like this can't really be trafficking. Or on the flip side, social support services, police officers will be like, well, it's not trafficking. This is just at this restaurant that we all know, or this massage parlor that is legitimate, or whatever the case may be. This one's really big because, for instance, in Pajaro Valley, oftentimes the growers are contracted out. So you'll have like a big grower like Driscoll Farms, but then within there's lots of subcontractors. And so you may have a subcontractor that's completely legitimate, and the workers are working alongside a subcontractor that is trafficking. It's employees, survivors, victims, and they're working alongside each other. And if you were just driving by, you would have no idea that that's a trafficking situation. So it's really important to understand that this can happen in so many different industries.
And sometimes those workers working right alongside are the whistleblowers. They're the ones who know the most or hearing the most. And so when we have a climate of fear where all farm workers are experiencing exploitation, or where because most farm workers have some connection with immigration, although 50% of farm workers are citizens or have legal status. I think over 50%, not to overgeneralize, but because the climate of fear that we're living in means that people feel more afraid to come forward. How will this impact me? How will this impact my family? So we really, having this climate of fear really hurts the fight against human trafficking.
Another one, only certain kind of individuals get trafficked or are traffickers. We're going to talk a lot about this. There is kind of a stereotype in a lot of people's heads about what a trafficking survivor looks like and what a trafficker looks like. And it's really important to kind of dispel those notions. Unfortunately, oftentimes the survivor is kind of viewed in this like perfect survivor model, where if you were in our last talk, you kind of heard about that, of a survivor who maybe just fits this model of a certain ethnicity, a certain kind of like socioeconomic class, and all of that. While traffickers are kind of looked at from a racialized lens on another spectrum, and also from a very gendered lens. And so kind of dispelling that notion, because if we aren't encompassing that, a trafficking survivor can be male, and if we aren't seeing that, and if we're just kind of seeing it from our gendered perspective, then we're missing all of those folks who really do need our services, and they also may not feel like they can come forward, they might not feel like they have the validation to come forward and seek support.
Well, and along the gender spectrum. So trans survivors, or I should say trans people, face really incredible employment discrimination. And so trafficking and commercial sex becomes an option when there's no other option. And then so much more vulnerability to exploitation and trafficking in that community, which includes, sadly, a lot of children.
Yes, definitely, unfortunately. And then trafficking survivors will immediately ask for help and identify as victims of a crime. This can be very confusing for a lot of people, because when they hear these stories about what these survivors have been through, and then especially for police officers, they go in, they say, we're taking you out of the situation, and survivors are like, I don't want to go with you, I don't identify as a survivor, this person isn't harming me, I want to be here. And people really have a hard time understanding how can that be? And a survivor may not realize, and we'll go into kind of what trauma bonding looks like, what grooming looks like, that are very important for understanding trafficking, and why a trafficking survivor may not identify as a victim of a crime immediately or even years down the road. And so those are all kind of just important things to kind of knock out before we get into some of the more meat of the conversation around. Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think another myth that I've heard quite a bit is that this stuff only happens in big cities. Like San Francisco.
Or overseas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Or overseas or nationally.
Mm-hmm. And I know I've talked to a lot of friends about this happening in San Cruz County, and there's just this idea that that's impossible, and so they could be missing signs, they could be not seeing what's kind of going on, because it's just that kind of stuff doesn't happen here.
Definitely NIMBY, they call it, not in my backyard, where people assume it can't happen here, it doesn't happen here, and so then therefore they either ignore it or they miss it, or if a survivor does reach out, they're like, I can't even comprehend what you're saying to me, because that doesn't happen.
Or maybe it's not as serious as the trafficking industry in a bigger city.
Exactly. Or you chose it somehow, some other kind of level that goes into that. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's huge.
It's really true.
Any other kind of myths?
Yeah.
It does. Yeah, that's literally the title of the talk. And so, talking about these myths, I think it's important to kind of address some of the media images that are out there that reinforce these myths. So we'll put all these guys up here. So these are some common images that you see when you Google human trafficking. You'll see, not for sale. You'll see kind of barcodes. Oftentimes, these pictures are very gendered. I mean, obviously, we can't see the gender of feet, but these pictures tend to be very, very gendered, with female identified people being noted as survivors. They also seem to be very kind of race bent, with most survivors being white women. Oftentimes, blonde-haired white women, just kind of reinforcing a notion of what a survivor could look like. So that survivor who is Latinx identified, who is queer, who is disabled, who does not look anything like some of these models, when they see this on a poster for trafficking, immediately feel excluded, immediately don't identify that this could be something that is happening to me. On the same end, folks who aren't being forced, so they don't feel as though like this identifies their experience, maybe they don't feel like someone was physically forcing them into this, this can really harm kind of the message, especially for C-sex survivors, so that's commercially sexually exploited children, for those that don't know. And a lot of those youth, sometimes, especially those who are LGBTQ, are in a situation where they have to, where they're out on the streets and they feel like their only options are to sell sex. And so because they feel that's their option, because they feel that they chose that, they feel that they don't really fit into this mode. And so it's really important to kind of dispel this from our mind of trafficking. The trafficking survivor could look like literally any one of us. It's really important. They could be going to school, they could be sitting on the bus next to you, they could be, like we said with the Driscoll Farm situation, right alongside you, and it's important to kind of have that overarching image that it can really happen to anyone.
Yeah, and I think, Sydney, you said it so well, because, it's we never want to have a situation where the information that's out there about human trafficking causes a child or a human trafficking survivor to say, oh, that's not me because it didn't look like it. What happened to me didn't look like that. At the same time, that's not to say that human trafficking can't look like this.
Definitely.
You know, we talked about the case around fishing in Indonesia. I mean, the reporting shows literally men in cages. Men in cages that before they published the photos, they had to extract off the island where they were being kept in order to make sure they literally survived the reporting. And I don't mean to say it also just looks like that overseas. You know, there's in some of the bondage and tied up pictures that when survivors see that, they don't relate to that being something that the trafficker did to them. They relate to that more to that being something that buyers have done to them, around different requests that buyers would have. And so then that, because then when they're with the trafficker, maybe they're looking like that, it impacts the psychology of thinking, well, because I didn't run, this must have been really my fault, or this must really be about me, rather than seeing the full scope of the massive trauma that human trafficking is in people's lives. And so you really want to change how we talk about human trafficking to make sure we're as accurate as possible, and having vulnerable survivors in mind at the fore when we do talk about it.
And one last thing I'll mention on this is just that this also doesn't encompass, and we'll talk a little bit more about it, but the kind of mental force or like the kind of gaslighting, coercion that goes on with trafficking. A lot of survivors, they might not feel like they are for sale in that sense because of the amount of mental abuse that's happened once they've gotten to that point. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But so some of these photos, so not to say that this doesn't happen, because this does happen, but that it doesn't give you the full scope of what human trafficking really looks like. Any questions?
I was wondering, sometime during this, is there a list of things to look for to tell people are doing that?
Yes.
Did you see get the thing that passed out earlier?
Oh, it's on there.
It's on there.
It's on the, yes, and we do also have slides that cover that. So with that, so that's not the only image of human trafficking, so then what can human trafficking look like? So for the TVPA, that's the Trafficking Victims Protection Act that we talked about earlier. They define kind of 3 stages of trafficking, or 3 components of trafficking. So there is the act, so that includes things such as recruitment, the transportation, if there is transportation, transfer, harbor, those kinds of things. So it'll be kind of act of trafficking, so getting the person in. The means, so how was this done? The means include things like force, fraud, coercion, what we talked about, those things. Threat kind of is in that use of fraud or force, deception, also basically fraud. And then you may have, abuse of power dynamics, or giving payments or benefits. So if someone is, like substance abuse addicted, that may be the means that you brought them into trafficking. And then the purpose. So what is the purpose of this? So you mentioned, does it just have to be like a monetary purpose? And we see that there's a kind of wide range of purposes. So from the prostitution of others to sexual exploitation, forced labor, just kind of similar slavery situations, even all the way through kind of really more extreme types, such as like the removal of organs and things of that nature. So these are kind of how human trafficking plays out in like the legal sense when officers and things of that nature are kind of looking at trafficking. These are the components that they're looking for. Any questions, Doctor?
These are called the AMP models. There's a couple different AMP models, so I'll just also say, we talked about that second part, where with the youth involved in commercial sex, forced fraud, coercion, these means don't have to be established. So there's a couple of different versions of these that law enforcement can look at, this one or this one or this one. But I think this is a really good illustrated one, since we're not doing a full law enforcement training today. We're talking about this.
And then, so where do these things occur? So major recruitment locations are so schools, unfortunately, libraries, shelters, parks, bus stops, abandoned buildings, juvenile detention centers. Really what this can look like is, so recruitment locations can happen anywhere where there's vulnerable individuals. If there's someone who's really looking for a job and they're kind of running in and around the mall frantically with resumes, that might be the perfect person for that trafficker to kind of reach out to. Oh, I've got a job for you. If a child is at a park and the trafficker sees them there all the time, they have no supervision, things like that. Oh, maybe this is a child that actually is pretty vulnerable. Maybe I can actually bring them in. Shelters, same thing. People are in desperate need of housing. It's a very vulnerable position to be in. Libraries, unfortunately, just some youth they don't fall into kind of some of the stereotype models of people who fall into trafficking. They're just for lack of a better word, average youth, but they still have needs that need to be fulfilled that traffickers can kind of lay out for them that can draw them in.
And they're virtual spaces too.
Yep.
I mean, traffickers are trying to find vulnerable people. They go to bed at night thinking about this, get up in the morning thinking about this. And the internet can also be a space where they're finding vulnerable people.
Definitely. And so some of the vulnerabilities to human trafficking. So traffickers take advantage of people's vulnerabilities. Some of those vulnerabilities include promising things like, so if someone, let's say, like one of the online examples that's pretty common is like someone wants to be like an Instagram influencer or a model or something like that, and so a trafficker just like, oh, I want to put you in a magazine, I want to kind of bring you in. And the crazy thing with this and the unfortunate thing is we've had survivors report where they actually did get modeling jobs, they actually did get acting careers. They were also being trafficked at the same time. And so within those legitimate businesses and within the things that they wanted that they got, they were still having these horrifying things happen to them. So we mentioned this already, but individuals who are substance dependent or addicted may be offered their primary substance of choice. You won't have to work, you won't have to do anything, I'll protect you as long as you're out on the streets, and then I'll give you the drugs that you want. And for some folks, that can be really, really enticing if they kind of have so many limited options and they don't have substance abuse treatment programs and some of the kind of collaboration piece that we talked about in our first talk. And then for those who are unemployed, that you'll have a job. That's huge for anybody. We mentioned again trans survivors who are so limited or trans individuals in general who are so limited in their ability to work and find really good employment. And so someone saying, I've got a really well-paying job for you, can be like a dream come true for some people. And so some common vulnerabilities that traffickers prey on include past trauma exposure. So if a survivor is exposed to like domestic violence or sexual assault, unfortunately, oftentimes their boundaries have already been crossed in really vital and like impactful ways. And traffickers, they can pick up on that. Within like the first few minutes, they will start crossing someone's boundaries in small ways that if someone is already kind of exposed to that, will hardly even notice. And unfortunately, that's when the trafficker knows, okay, this might be somebody that I can really kind of bring in and run the trick on, as they say. And so then we have LGBTQ individuals. Unfortunately, this is also very true with LGBTQ youth. LGBTQ youth are the only minority that are most likely to be pushed out of their homes by their families and suffer family rejection. Other minority individuals, suffer maybe community rejection and things of that nature, but LGBTQ individuals oftentimes will be, pushed out from the family. And that can be hugely impactful, not having access to food, clothing, really anything if they are under a certain age or even over a certain age. And so someone coming in and saying, not only do I see you and I value you as a person, but now I can provide you these things that can be everything that an LGBTQ person is looking for. And unfortunately, traffickers know that and they prey on that. And then isolated individuals as well. So LGBTQ oftentimes are isolated. So isolated individuals just in general, folks who maybe oftentimes you'll hear of survivors who are trafficked when they left their hometown and went to college for the first time and they weren't around anybody that they knew. Isolation can occur when, a boyfriend that they thought, or a trafficker that they thought was a boyfriend says, let's go on a trip, and now we are, states away and the trafficking begins. Or in some cases it can look like, oh, I have a job for you, it's in like this other city, and that's when the trafficking begins. And then also poverty, and so foster youth is important also because foster youth have kind of a transient, unfortunate life, like they get moved around often and don't really have a lot of control over that, and they also tend to run away because of that, and are also often trauma exposed. Then you have poverty, which is, I think, kind of a little self-explanatory. Those who need money are unfortunately very vulnerable to people who say, I have money and I can get it for you. Immigration status is huge, especially in a really negative climate that we have right now, the climate of fear, where if someone says, you're gonna work for me and I have your papers and I'm not giving you your papers back, that can be so huge. Or the threat of, I will call ICE on you if you do go get services. keeps people in really vulnerable situations. And similar to LGBTQ people, folks who are undocumented don't always have access to the same range of work opportunities and the ability to feed their families. So that means they're a little more likely to be victims of trafficking because of that need. And then false hopes and promises. All of us have hopes and dreams and things of that nature, and sometimes somebody just offers them to us, and we're in a low, vulnerable space. We're in a space where maybe something bad has happened to us. Maybe we've lost an important person in our family. Maybe, whatever the case may be. And so that can be huge. And then addictions and disabilities are also very big. Just that they create vulnerable populations that unfortunately traffickers prey on, especially with disabilities, those who have mental disabilities and so may not be able to cognitively kind of understand what the trafficker is saying and what's happening to them. It's really unfortunate.
And there's certainly a lot of vulnerabilities we could put on there that are to expand that list, but also just being a human being who has connections. There's a survivor leader, Rachel Thomas, who's done a lot of education in our community. The vulnerability she had is she went to a job interview, put her parents' address, and she was an adult, she was in college, she had a lot of things going for her. Really not things that are on this list of vulnerabilities, but the vulnerability was she put her parents' address on the application, and the trafficker threatening the life of her family was enough to keep her trafficked for many months in Atlanta.
We've seen other ones where survivors, the trafficker knows where their like sibling goes to school, and they send them a picture like, I'm literally at your sibling's school right now. If you don't come with me, if you don't continue to do what I'm going to do, I'm going to harm your sibling. And so those kinds of things are huge vulnerabilities. You can just have like a person that is, but so this is isn't an exhaustive list. But I also want to put a caveat, vulnerabilities are not weaknesses. Sometimes people can kind of take that away like, oh, well, those folks are weak. And that is not the case at all. Vulnerabilities are not weaknesses. We all have vulnerabilities. And so that's why it's important for us to address like making sure that we're creating safe spaces for LGBTQ individuals, for foster youth, making sure that we also have safe spaces for those who are impoverished so that they have job training programs that are legitimate, making sure that we're creating those spaces and addressing vulnerability and not seeing it as a weakness. And so some of the warning signs for trafficking. So for sex trafficking, warning signs, so this particularly for youth, could be things like expensive items such as like purses, clothes, cell phones, like the fancy nails, but they have no job, or they're 13 and
multiple cell phones.
Yes.
Cell phones where it's not clear who's paying for that cell phone bill. There's always a cell phone bill.
Definitely.
There's a cell phone.
And kind of just a really, and it's hard for some people to suss out with teens, but there's like an intense attachment to the phone. Because that's usually how the trafficker will get a hold of them if there is a trafficker, or how the buyers will get a hold of them. And so if someone's being trafficked, that cell phone they will not allow, it's kind of an obsessiveness around the cell phone. But definitely so kind of taking, into account if you're seeing someone with really expensive items, especially a youth, and you're like, how would a 13-year-old girl have a Gucci, I don't even know if people have that, so like a Gucci wallet and things like that, just asking yourself those questions.
And I'll say, I don't know if anyone else thought, I don't know a teenager that's not super attached to their phone. We're talking about something that's on a different level.
Exactly.
One of the things you'll see up here is exhaustion. Probably, if, a lot of people in this room, if you had the opportunity to take a nap right now, you might, a lot of people are exhausted all the time. We're talking about something that's at a different level. If you're thinking to yourself, she seems terrified to be separated from her cell phone.
Mm-hmm.
Or this is the most exhausted person I've ever seen in my life. Those are the kinds of warning signs we're talking about.
Definitely. Multiple reproductive health problems, or STIs, especially again in youth, can be a kind of red flag or warning sign. Irregular school attendance for those who are attending school, another warning sign. Malnutrition for both adults and youth, if someone is looking really kind of malnourished or famished. Alcohol and drug use, and really kind of with a bit of a asterisk there. So if we're seeing someone who just feels like again, asterisks, because we see this all the time, unfortunately, with substance abuse, but someone who's just needing that to get through, that's the only way that's buoying them through the situation. Mental health problems, so things like PTSD, depression, paranoia, emotional distress. If a youth has a significantly older boyfriend, so if a 14-year-old is talking about their 23-year-old boyfriend, that's a huge warning sign. Language around the life, so life is usually sex trafficking, what people used to call prostitution. But so things like calling someone a daddy or a mommy, the bottom, often it's called, well, like bottom bitch is usually what it is. And then the life is what they usually will like term, or like the game is another kind of term. They may say things like the square life. There's those kinds of things. If you hear language like that, it may be a warning sign.
But what is the bottom?
So that is, so within sex work, within trafficking sex work, usually traffickers will designate one worker kind of their main person, and that's the bottom.
It's often the person who's been exploited the longest.
Mhm.
So maybe someone who's been exploited from a very, very young age. And if it's a trafficking dynamic, often in commercial sex, or exclusively in commercial sex, where the trafficker has a group of people they're controlling. So it might be the oldest person in that group, the one who has experienced the worst abuse, have the most, the deepest bond, trauma bond with that trafficker. And sadly, because of all of those reasons, it's of all victims who face criminalization, they're the most likely to get arrested. Because if law enforcement doesn't see this as someone who's been trafficked for often a decade, they might see this as someone, oh, well, you went to the hotel room, you were the only adult with this 14-year-old, you were the one who the 14-year-old scared of because you're playing this enforcer role. And so it's a very vulnerable position, this, what we call the bottom dynamic, so it's part of the complexity of human trafficking. Sometimes people want human trafficking to be a very simple issue. It's actually a very complex issue. And understanding the nature of trauma and its long-term impact is really important in all of this.
And then, and also last thing on sex trafficking, well, not the last one, inside the last one here, is youth or child with knowledge of sexual behavior. So a child who's kind of being over-sexualized or is over-sexualizing themselves might be someone who is at risk.
The branding and tattoos for Santa Cruz.
Yeah, so we get a lot of questions about tattoos because sometimes traffickers, they're kind of wising up to this, but sometimes traffickers will have particular brands, particular images. We don't, unless we're doing law enforcement training, we don't tend to say, here are the things to look for, because survivors sometimes can't get that removed or trying to have a life after that. But it's an important thing to know that that sometimes traffickers will literally brand people. And talking about resilience, sometimes survivors choose to keep those tattoos to understand this is where I've been through, this is what these are like my warrior scars. And there's some really innovative work around helping survivors transform those tattoos with a tattoo of their own design. There's a survivor-led group called Survivors Inc. that funds that tattoo change, so more than just removal, really transforming it. So it can be something that becomes really beautiful in a survivor's life. But we generally caution people from saying, look for this tattoo, even though it does have some trends.
Yeah, so
and it speaks to the impunity that traffickers are acting under, that they're like, I'm literally going to put this permanent mark of my exploitation of you.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to say go looking for people's tattoos. I was just asking for this county, is that done?
So the thing that we're on a circuit, there's a circuit that really runs from San Francisco to Los Angeles. So it's the same things you'd see in San Francisco and Los Angeles. Because it's permanent, things that were true 5-10 years ago can still be there, even though it's like someone might not be being controlled by that particular trafficker, but someone else. But for law enforcement, it can be a really powerful tool to say, here's a image that's on a particular area, and it busted. There was in Arizona, there was a whole ring that was busted, and here we've just identified someone who has that same mark. It can be a really useful tool.
Cool.
So it's absolutely true. So it's an important thing to bring to the conversation.
So for labor trafficking, I'm going to go a little quicker just because we're running out of time here.
We're almost at time. I think we're supposed to.
I think we are, yeah. So I'll just kind of run through quickly because I do want to tell you all about grooming and trauma bonding, so that is important. So just for some of the warning signs, labor trafficking, so not allowed to go out in public alone.
Those are on this handout, so maybe we can go right
sweet.
through it.
Awesome. Okay.
Yeah, so
So
they're on the handout.
So understanding grooming. Grooming has multiple stages, and so this is really the crux of why human trafficking does not need physical force and why trafficking survivors may not identify as survivors or victims of a crime. So first comes the targeting of the victim. So that is when the trafficker says, this is the person that I think that I can traffic, this is the person I think that I can bring in, because they've identified maybe some vulnerability, they've started to kind of test the waters of crossing boundaries. Then they begin with the gaining trust. So now this is where like I'm talking to you, kind of finding out like, oh, maybe I find out that your parents don't accept your LGBTQ status. Maybe I find out that you're undocumented. Maybe I find out that you've been sexually exploited before. Those kinds of things are huge for the trafficker to gain trust. And in some ways, they may even say things like, oh, I've been there. I was abused and things like that to kind of gain the survivor's trust. Once they have the trust, then they begin filling the needs. So if I was a survivor who, maybe I have been in foster youth since I was 2 years old, I don't know my parents, I've never had a good connection with my foster family, and this person's saying like, I'm gonna take care of you. And for the last 2-3 months, they've been taking care of me, they've been giving me food, giving me money, I'm living the life that I want. So that is really huge with fulfilling the needs. So providing substance, providing whatever the person needs and is missing, and that they've kind of found out in the gaining the trust piece. Then comes isolation. So I've got your trust. So now I might be your boyfriend, I might be your friend, and so I'm going to kind of isolate you. And so for survivors, oftentimes this is why they don't always identify as survivors, because this was my friend that I went to this place with. This was my boyfriend or my girlfriend. So it doesn't immediately register as, oh, this is a trafficking situation. So then isolation happens, and this isolation is very key for a trafficker to abuse a survivor. And then the abuse begins. So again, survivors may not even realize like what's happening here. So very similar with domestic violence, where when the first initial abuse begins, survivors are like, this came up completely out of left field. I thought you cared about me. I thought you were providing me support. And then there's maintain control. And so maintain control does not have to be physical force. It can now be that I've been getting in your head for the last 6 months, the last 6 weeks even, telling you that you deserve this, that you're worthless, that this is all you've ever amounted to, and I'm one person and I'm just kind of feeding you that information, or threatening your family members, your siblings, any of that. And so this is really, really huge. If any of you want this information, I can send this to you, because I would really like you to just kind of understand trauma or grooming, and then really quickly, trauma bonding. So what is trauma bonding? So trauma bonding explains the phenomenon of survivors developing emotional attachments to their abusers, exploiters, or traffickers. It's been observed in child abuse, intimate partner violence, human trafficking, hostage situations, cults. It used to be called Stockholm Syndrome, so you may have known it under that name. And why does it occur? So if you know anything about classical conditioning, it's kind of very similar, where a survivor is on constant kind of cycle of intermittent rewards and punishment. So if a survivor doesn't, act in a certain way, doesn't comply with the trafficker, then they are punished. If they comply, if they're submissive, so I just do the work for 12 hours, don't complain, or I, meet with this many Johns, whatever the case may be, then the survivor is rewarded with good treatment from the trafficker, maybe even, elevation in the case of the bottom, that's like seen as a reward to get to that level, something for other people to kind of aspire to. And that kind of creates a situation where now the trafficker is always looking to please, or the trafficking survivor is always looking to please the trafficker. Their mind is constantly on a loop of how can I make this person happy? How can I make this person happy? So when a officer comes in and says, this person is harming you, for them it can be very difficult, because they're like, no, this is the person treating me good when I behave well. And so it's a very intense psychological effect that can be very, very hard to detangle. It's why a lot of survivors will never testify on the stand against their trafficker, because for them, this is the person that I am bonded to. In my worst moments, they were there for me. In some cases, it may be that the John really abused the survivor, and the trafficker is the person who's treating them well. And that might be a situation where now they feel kind of indebted to the trafficker.
And it's hard to understand, but sometimes it can literally be the trafficker created that worst moment, and then they were also there for me in that moment. And no one else would understand what we've been through together, even though it's literally the trauma was created by that trafficker.
Definitely.
I have a question about just general bystander training. So a lot of what I'm hearing, it's almost like you have to have a bit of an intimate knowledge as to what the person that's being trafficked, what their circumstances are in terms of vulnerability and stuff like STIs, for instance. I'll give you an example. I was at a local restaurant here in Santa Cruz. This was probably 3 weeks ago, and these 2 women walked in to use the restroom. One was probably in her 30s, one was 13. Okay, and the 13-year-old had a tank top on with bruises all across her back. And she was following this woman in, just very blank-faced. they went into the bathroom, and I'm sitting with some colleagues, and we're starting to talk about what does this mean. The older woman comes out, and she's engaging with the restaurant staff. That looks kind of legitimate. A younger girl is still in there. And I'm not sure what the hell to do, but I know it doesn't feel like this isn't right. And so I eventually did call 911, but by the time I had reconciled, like, this doesn't feel good, I had already walked far enough away that I wasn't able to, get a grasp of it. And, so I wonder, like, when we see things that make us feel uncomfortable, what is the appropriate response?
We still are really quickly Monarch services, and one of the things that you might be able to utilize is that one.
That might be a good slide to end on.
Oh, totally. But this number right here may be something that's just as easy as just like giving the driver, like, hey, I don't know what your situation is, but if this is a kind of a bad situation, here's the phone number. And also, kind of calling. You are kind of having that sense to call 911, but obviously you did that, and they can only do so much if they're not there. But if you have that ability to kind of slip in after them and say, here's a phone number, here's whatever the case may be, the human trafficking number, whatever that might be kind of a huge thing. And also come into Monarch Services, we can get you some crisis line cards.
I'm just worried about her vulnerability if I were to intervene.
That's
Exactly, exactly,
right.
and that's a real thing. I mean, so we always have some hesitation about just saying involve law enforcement, because sometimes, especially if law enforcement hasn't had training in this, might be coming across in a shaming or a really traumatizing way. I mean, and a lot of survivors report being abused, sexually abused by police officers. So it's hard to know. A great path when there's time is the National Trafficking Hotline number, which can report directly here to Santa Cruz and contact the local most trained department, or not department, but in a department, the most trained person. So the person responding has that. But the thing I heard you say is that this sounds like a pretty young kid who's been pretty beaten up. And that makes this, I think, something where maybe the timing that's involved with that might not work. And, so just saying there's, a child that seems pretty clearly in distress, that might raise that to a more immediate 911 call in this circumstance.
And so we'll finish on this slide. So just kind of, where was it? Oh, there we go. So changing the language, because it's really important that we create a space where survivors can come forward, where they can identify and where they can get services. So changing the language from soup to nuts, top down, from administration on the way down to, us service workers.
So we have that exercise that we're actually going to skip for time. You can stick around for any further questions people have. We love questions. But just as a takeaway, if there's one thing that you can take away from this session to ask to change going forward in the future, it would be around leaving the language of prostitution behind. Prostitution, you might have noticed we're not really using that language, even though we're talking about commercial sex. But it's language that comes out of criminalization. And it's an identity that once it's put on a person, means that it follows them the rest of their life. It's deeply stigmatizing. It's sometimes treated like, oh, well, that's the term, that's what's in the evidence code, that's the academic language. But we really want to ask our community to just stop using this language. Because if we're applying it to people who may be human trafficking survivors, or if we're talking about terms like teen prostitution or child prostitution, we're talking definitely about a human trafficking survivor. That can convey a lasting, lifelong stigma onto that child, and we just want to make sure that we have that kind of transformation in our community. And confront it when we see it. If I see it in the paper, I contact the local media to say we really want to be better on this subject. And this is part of an entire paradigm moving away from criminalizing survivors of human trafficking. Instead of seeing someone as a delinquent, as a criminal, seeing them as someone who's a victim of a very serious crime. And anytime we're talking about transforming the language, we have to talk about this climate of fear that we're in. Because there's no human being that's an alien. There's no human being who is illegal. Not to say that there aren't people who are under particular fear because of their undocumented status. So calling people as undocumented, as an adjective, rather than any kind of language that puts an identity on a person.
To
I think with that we
What
can.
does CSEC mean?
Oh, it's up here, thank you. So commercial, sexual exploitation of children. So it's a good alternative to a term like this old paradigm of teen prostitute, child prostitute. It's we use it in our community. If you attended our earlier session, we talked about a CSEC protocol. So a lot of times, people who are working in this field will just refer to that acronym, CSEC, rather than the full long words.
And I'll leave these resources up here. You can just talk about them. But these are just some great resources if you want to know more about human trafficking, kind of deepen your understanding of trafficking and the dynamics of trafficking. Especially this book right here, if you really want to understand the dynamics of CSEC and why it does not always take physical force for a survivor to be CSEC, I would definitely check that out. And then also, I Am Jane Doe. I'm pretty sure it's on Netflix. Amazing. And Rape This Field is also amazing. So yeah, and feel free. I'll leave this up. You can take pictures or take those notes down. Yeah. Any other questions or?
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you all.